Hey, dear listeners. So I thought I would read your emails and answer them today. And I came across one email from famous patron Lyndon, or FPL. He is a listener to the podcast that goes back, I think maybe to like 2013 or something. He was a big part of our lives because he would send in these questions that were just so smart and thought-provoking. And he is still around and sent this really thought-provoking email. And so I thought I would dedicate today's episode to answering it. He is asking about boundaries and systems theory and about the culture that will co-opt certain words like boundaries and stuff. It's pretty complicated. I think it'll give me a chance to talk about things that I don't normally get to talk about. This will get pretty technical, I think, because I think we're going to get into a lot of technical language, clinical language around systems and boundaries and differentiation, Minuchin, Bowen, all that stuff. And I'm actually recording this intro after I recorded the whole response to his email. Maybe that'll help as we move forward. So let's get into the beginning of the episode. When I stop talking now, it'll be going back in time when I first started reading his email. FPL says, I've been thinking about writing a few things. Oh, first off, hi Kirk, long time no write. I've been thinking about writing a few things recently, and I found this article and thought you might find it interesting. It's about boundaries, and the article mentions Minuchin, Bowen, etc. All right, so just chiming in here. So FPL sending this article on boundaries that mentions Minuchin, Bowen. So, these are family therapist theorists who talked a lot of, particularly Minuchin talked about boundaries. Bowen did as well. So yeah, those are two good things to mention. Going on here. In a move not uncommon with writers in edutainment, the article critiques the concept, but actually gives some credit to it early on. So they're saying that the article critiques the concept of boundaries and gives credit to it. Okay. And then there's a quote here. Most actual boundaries experts would agree that telling your partner who to spend time with is a symptom of terrible boundaries. End of quote. And then FPL goes on to say, I'm not sure what an actual boundaries expert is. I confess I somewhat took the idea of boundaries as a good thing at face value, but I still have some sympathy for the political and cultural arguments later in the piece. So just chiming in here. Yeah. So first off, we have to define what boundaries are. And the typical usage among lay people is that, and really even therapists outside of marriage and family therapy. And really, there's a lot of marriage and family therapists who use the word boundary wrong. Wrong. I will say, I'll say wrong, because there are family therapists that will say, well, as Minuchin said about boundaries, and then they head into this area. I'm like, you don't understand what boundaries are. It's kind of hard to understand, honestly, because, but in a nutshell, what the family theorists would say about boundaries is that a boundary exists between two elements. Commonly, we might say that there's a boundary between you and another person, right? But there can also be boundaries around an entire family, or around a couple and the rest of the world, or between the hierarchy and the family. You can have a boundary between the parents and the children, right? You can have a boundary between you and politics, or you and the internet, right? So it's just a way of talking about how permeable and how flexible that boundary is. Because in healthy systems, whether it's family systems or cellular systems, there has to be some boundary. A cell in the body can't have a shell to the cell that lets everything in, right? Because then I don't know the wording for this, but it wouldn't function correctly. You also can't have a boundary around the cell that is completely impermeable, because I don't know if there's any cell in the body that doesn't absorb at least something. I'm guessing it always has to absorb something, because it has to process fuel or something. But so it has to be permeable, but not too permeable. And it also depends on what the situation calls for, right? So you also have to have flexibility to how permeable and how impermeable the boundary is. So, for example, what Mnuchin and Bowen and all these family theorists were getting at is that, if I was to talk about me and my wife, when, like last night, we were out to dinner and we were walking to the car, I think, or we got home and we were walking from the car to our front door, and I just had this upwelling of love for my wife, and so I, said something like, "Hey, come here," and she knows what that means. We have our ways of indicating, like, "Hey, I want some loving right now," or, "Oh, I have a warm feeling of love for you. Let's hug and kiss." And so that's what I did. And she came in and pressed herself up to get. This isn't anyway. Point is, I wanted to say that because that's what happened, but then I started getting like pornographic. So it wasn't. But so in that moment, I wanted the boundary, or a more correct way of saying it is that in order for the system to operate optimally, the system of me and my family, and more specifically me and my wife, the Kirk and Stacy system, in order for that to work optimally, in that moment, it was needed that the boundary between us needed to be flexible to open up a lot in that moment and have a lot of exchange. Really, I guess you could extend it for the whole night, right? Because we were at dinner and we're just the two of us talking about all sorts of stuff and talking about personal things and things that are important to us, meaningful to us, not the whole time, but some. And it needed to be opened in that moment, right? It needs to be able to facilitate a lot of back and forth exchange and a lot of trust in the other person. And when we hugged and kissed, it even almost starts to feel like there is no boundary between us. It's just one person. If we go physically even further, then it really starts to feel like we're just one person. Not really like we're one person, but it's, physically and emotionally and spiritually, it's like you start to lose the boundary between the two people, right? And in order for it to function optimally, it calls for that. Because if we didn't have that permeability or that flexibility to become permeable, then we wouldn't be able to be close in that moment. We wouldn't be able to capitalize. Another dimension is how fast does it adjust, right? If we both, or the system called for, is a better way to put it, if the system called for the boundary to move from its normal state to a more permeable state, then it took too long for it to adjust. Like it took the boundary, the boundary takes 3 hours to eventually become permeable, then we wouldn't be able to benefit from that because it would take too long to get there. The whole time while we're at dinner, we're not really opening up. We're just talking about surface things, or we're triangulating a lot of things from the outside of the relationship, or we're just not even talking, or we're not capitalizing on the moment. So there's a dimension of permeability, and there's a dimension of flexibility, and there's a dimension of how rapid the adjustment is. And so there's that. Now, in contrast to that, if, for example, Stacy is really upset about something, like a common thing she'll be upset about is, not common, but that happens occasionally, that she'll come home and she'll tell me about someone on the highway that almost ran her off the road, just a bad driver. And it, understandably freaks her out, and she has, some pent up kind of, not only just rage about it, but also just unbridled fear around, just like, oh my God, it can be really unnerving to have that happen, right? Or if someone like road rages on her, which doesn't happen very often, but if that ever happens, that's pretty unnerving. And so she comes home and she's starting to tell me the story. Now, if I have a complete block up, then that's not going to work. Is if the boundary is too rigid and impermeable, then I'm not there to listen or to empathize, right? So that's another aspect of this boundary crossing, is that in order for me to empathize, I have to open up, or the boundary, I should say, has to open up so that, because, I keep trying to word it in a more systemic language. Instead of saying I'm opening the boundary, the system is calling for the boundary to be opened up. And the system is, being called upon to adjust so that everything operates optimally. That's the way systemic people think and talk. Contrary to what the general public taught, the way they talk, and other counselors, they'll use boundaries as something that we have control of individually. And that's never true. Like, I don't have complete control over the boundary between me and my wife. It's something that is created a lot of times subconsciously and through routines over time. Now, this is different from limits, which I'll get into in a second, which is a different concept, right? People often use the word boundaries as limits. That is completely controlled by you. You can control your limits and your ground rules or your principles or your policies about things, But anyway, so boundaries, so in that moment, wife comes home, she's really upset. If the boundary is too impermeable, if there's too much exchange going across from me and her, then I might become completely unglued emotionally, right? And that the system, the health of the system depends on me not doing that, because if I, if that happened, and it does happen sometimes, then I might, just start to say, I'm going to find this guy and kill him or something. Or I might freak out and say, you can't drive anymore. Or what did you do? Did you drive badly? I might start blaming her, right? Because I'm starting to lose perspective, right? I'm panicking. I can't do that, right? So I need to have some boundary up. There needs to be some impermeableness to the boundary. But I can't have it completely impermeable, because then I won't listen or know what she's feeling. I have to absorb some of it, right? And the optimal, the system, in order to be optimal, is calling for a boundary that is somewhat permeable but not completely permeable. Okay, and the situations can change all over the board, right? If she wants to just be alone for a while, then I need to. The system is calling for that boundary to be pretty closed off, and the system needs to be able to adjust to that. So there's flexibility, there's permeability, and then the speed of onset of optimal boundaryness. Okay, that's what boundaries are. Now, what people tend to use the word boundaries is to say, I have a boundary about this, and sure, language is language. And lay people and non-marriage and family therapists can certainly use that language. It's fine. But if you're a marriage and family therapist, at the very least, you need to understand when you're using that word of boundaries, it's not the systemic theory word of boundaries. Okay. So, and of course, I could talk a long time about what all the theorists were also getting at about boundaries between the family system and the rest of the world. Between extended family, right? There's all these scenarios where the boundaries are in question or worthy of evaluating. Like, a common example is that you have two people that are getting married, or they're, developing a stronger relationship. They're moving in together or something. And previous to that new relationship deepening, they were really involved with their parents, for example, or their friends or their work or something. Well, if the boundaries don't all adjust somehow, then this couple will have a hard time developing the intimacy that's required for them to feel together and bonded and attached. So that's another aspect of boundaries, is that the routine of the boundary, the pattern of the boundary, the programming, if you will, the software that runs how the boundary operates needs to adjust over time, which is a kind of a global system change. Like, for example, like when Stacy and I first met, I was, my current social life or my relationships were such that I spent a lot of time and I had a lot more closeness with, say, friends and other people in my life, right? But when Stacy and I started to become more serious, then the whole system and all the boundaries had to change their software. They had to change their routine. And meaning that if, like, I'm trying to, this is kind of hard to explain, but point is that the way I describe the boundaries between me and my wife in those two scenarios, if a system has to reinvent the rules of the boundaries every single time, it's too laborious and there's too much chaos. So with systems, with human systems, family systems, relationship systems, the idea is that we seek homeostasis, which is it requires the least amount of work to sustain that routine, where everyone basically understands their roles and how they're supposed to respond. And boundaries are included in that, because boundaries are socially created. They're created collectively by everyone involved. And when there's a major shift, like before Stacy and then after Stacy, all the routines have to change. All the rules of the game have to change at least slightly and operate on a different set of rules. And so that's another dimension to boundaries, is that there are different states of boundaries that, like, for example, this is kind of a weird, I don't want to say being a state. Let's say you take another couple and they break up, okay? Well, the boundary between, say the wife and the ex-partner, that boundary has to change its routine, right? And there can be some weird situations where you might divorce your partner and still reach out to them when important events happen to you, even though you don't want to, because that's the routine. I could go on and on about this. I wish I had like a specific example to kind of get my hands into. But anyway, so that's what FPL, is often really interested in this kind of stuff. Lyndon is very smart, and as a non-clinician really learns all this kind of stuff. And so that's what he's getting at. And so getting back to this article, it says, quote, most actual boundaries experts would agree that telling your partner who to spend time with is a symptom of terrible boundaries. Okay, unquote. So that is not talking about boundaries, about the boundaries in family systems theory, because in the beginning of the article, apparently they're talking about Minuchin and Bowen. Minuchin and Bowen are talking about the boundaries I was just talking about. They're using the word boundaries to talk about limits or policies, personal preferences. That's all that is, okay? So there's that. The writer simply doesn't understand what they're talking about. And even if they went to other therapists, even family therapists, they wouldn't necessarily get good information. The fact that I understand systems theory and boundaries and all that stuff to the degree that I do is not because it was easily understood by me. It took me maybe 15 years of literally teaching this in my classes repeatedly for it to kind of start to gel, and then to apply it to real situations is a whole other thing, right? Because you can sort of get it, but it's like, how do you apply this? It's really hard. So, I don't blame people, but from right off the bat, it looks like this writer doesn't know what they're talking about. I wish people just stuck to their lane, just talk about in your own language, right? Anyway, so there's that. Then the person just makes a claim without any sort of citation or anything, any sort of research. Most actual boundaries experts, and Lyndon is smart to say, what's a boundaries expert? Yeah, it's not like a certification we have as a therapist. Most actual, and even the word actual, like, what do you mean? So there's like actual boundaries experts and then there's like fake? No, it's not a thing. Most actual boundaries experts would agree that telling your partner who to spend time with is a symptom of terrible boundaries. And even that word symptom, why would you, anyway, it's a sign, just say a sign. Symptom implies that you're in this clinical world. You're not, because you don't know what you're talking about. But anyway, so, all right, so let's get at the core of this sentence. By the way, this email is really long, and I'm in the first little bit here. Most experts agree that telling your partner who to spend time with is bad, essentially. It depends, right? If your partner cheats on you and you're going through recovery, and you as the victim ask your partner, hey, I don't want you to hang out with the person that you were having sex with behind my back for the past 3 years. That's depends on the situation, of course, but it's like these blanket statements, right? Now, what they're getting at, of course, yeah, absolutely. If I were to tell Stacy that she can't hang out with one of her friends, then let's just say that's bad. Let's not even put a clinical word to it. It's unfair, right? Is it a symptom of terrible boundaries? I don't even know what they mean by that. I don't know. I just wish people stuck to that. Okay. Actually, let's take a break. So going on with the email here, Lyndon quotes from the article. Oh, Lyndon actually says, I think the central thesis of the article is stated less than halfway into the article. And then Lyndon quotes the article saying, I am not anti-boundaries, but they are so rarely questioned because they have a seductive moral authority as the dominant metaphor for how human relationships should work. So let's break this down. I am not anti-boundaries. Okay, I'm not entirely sure what you mean by even boundaries. I think what the author is meaning, without reading the article and just reading it through Lyndon's excerpts here, I suppose I could have looked up the article. I'm pretty sure Lyndon actually even sent me the link, but I'm being lazy. But the quote, I'm not, so, boundaries, I think the author was defining as saying that you have, and I think specifically limits on, or requests on what you would request of your partner. Like, I would request that you not hang out with that person, or I would request that you don't go to that party. I'm guessing it's that kind of, that's not a boundary. That's weird to even say it that, and I wonder if people are even using the word boundary to justify that kind of thing, right? Because, and this happens, I just see this more and more, or maybe it's always happening, I don't know, but where you have this concept drift where in the beginning, this idea of boundaries is for a limited set of situations in our society. The word, I have a boundary about this, would be applied to, I have a boundary about my workplace asking me to work on Sunday. I have a boundary about that. So most people would say, yeah, that's a good thing to have as a boundary, and also it's maybe an appropriate use of the word boundary. You're saying, I'm not going to allow this other thing to encroach into my space, meaning work, into my Sunday, okay? Then people start to realize that, there's this word called boundary that a lot of people get behind. There's an audience that is watching this rhetoric around boundaries, and the audience is observing this and there's some power in the word boundaries, because a lot of people get behind other people who claim they have boundaries. Well, some of the audience will use it appropriately, but there's a group in the audience that will pull the concept of boundaries far afield, or at least a little bit afield from the meaning. And so they'll say, I have a boundary about you spending time with that person. Okay. In terms of the spirit of the definition, we're no longer talking about boundaries in the original sense. Now we're co-opting the word boundaries because the individual wants to use something that they believe has power, that they believe will get support, maybe even on Twitter or something, right? I have boundaries. Like if someone just said on Twitter, like, my husband won't respect my boundaries, and be, oh, that's not okay. But then when you hear what they're using the word boundaries for, it's like, I don't want my husband to have friends. I have a boundary about that. Well, then we're like, well, Jesus, so then it dilutes it, right? Then the original people that are using boundaries in a helpful way and in an empowering way, it ruins it for them, because now, and this is the same with narcissism and gaslighting and trauma bonding, and all these words get co-opted. And I could go on and on. You get old, you start seeing these trends with words, and this element, I'm sure linguists and anthropologists have some kind of concept around this whole thing I'm talking about. I'm sure I'm not inventing this, but I've never heard anyone talk about it to my knowledge, and so I'm just kind of observing it and having this sort of layperson language around it. Anyway, so what this person, this author, is doing, I think, is reacting against people that are using the word boundaries as a way to make a bad request seem more justifiable. Okay, so then the author says, I'm not anti-boundaries. Okay, it's hard by the definition that you're using, but they are also so rarely questioned because they have a seductive moral authority. Yeah, so I think that's what actually I was talking about. So I guess I'm kind of agreeing with this person as the dominant metaphor for how human relationships should work. Yeah, I think that's coherent to me, depending on what we mean by boundaries, of course. Going on. So just chime in, little tangent, is that it's the same thing with trigger warnings. So I don't know the full history on trigger warnings. I used to know a lot more details about this, but I know enough to say this, that for a time, maybe in the beginning, but at the very least, there was a sizable group of people that were using the word trigger warning to refer to PTSD trigger in ways that make total sense to us. You would have a professor in a class with a bunch of freshmen in college, and the professor, as a part of their teaching of a class, let's say it's like film class, and the professor shows a scene in which a woman is raped, whether it's a girl with a dragon tattoo or it's The Accused. I think that's a movie that called with Jodie Foster. These are graphic scenes and hard to watch. So for everyone, it's going to be hard. But if people sign up for a class, well, so let me talk about trigger warning. Okay, so the original usage of trigger warning was for those people in the class who have actual PTSD because they had been raped. They have been raped. They're a student in the class, and they have PTSD, because not everyone who is sexually assaulted will develop PTSD. Many do, understandably, right? And either they're in recovery and they haven't fully recovered, or they don't even know what recovery is. They're just trying to survive. And they're sitting in class and they're in the middle of the row, and under normal circumstances, they can manage, right? But they're forced to watch this scene, and it'll skyrocket their distress. It's very, very upsetting, not only just in the moment, but it could ruin their life for months. People can be triggered from their PTSD, and it could be such an overload neurologically, and also it can be very disorienting consciously as well, because when you have all these symptoms, you start questioning, is it safe to go to class? Is it safe to leave my house? Is there something wrong with me? Should I just turn off my emotions? Should I push everyone away from me because the person gets home and they're kind of short with their partner? So there's all these symptoms that generate from that triggering and that distress that pulls people away, causes people to be more isolating of themselves and their mind. And so it can really cause a lot of havoc. So there are these advocates saying, hey, trigger warning. That's all you have to do is at the beginning of class, preferably at the beginning of the course, and before the class begins, you would send out an email to everyone. By the way, we're going to watch this clip. If that is a trigger for you, you are free to not come to class until the second hour or something like that. Because you don't want to do a trigger warning when people are sitting in class, because then people have to self-disclose that they have been assaulted by standing up and walking out. So there's all these principles around trigger warning. I don't think they're going to get a lot of people that are going to say that that's stupid or that's coddling or something, right? Well, under my understanding is that for people that were uncomfortable with things, they saw this concept called trigger warnings, and it was this powerful word this phrase that people tended to honor. And although these individuals, so you have this audience of people that's watching this trigger warning exchange happen, right? And then a group in the audience will say, "Ooh, I have PTSD. I want that." Or you have a group of people that doesn't have PTSD that's like, "Ooh, I get that. I understand what we're doing here with trigger warnings." You have another group in the audience that has an experience that has nothing to do with PTSD, and maybe just has to do with their own preferences. And maybe they're a little narcissistic. They believe they're entitled to have the world conform to everything that they prefer. And they don't prefer to watch a rape scene. That's not what they choose to do. And when they watch a rape scene in class, they're not being harmed neurologically or psychologically or emotionally. They just don't like it. And maybe they do experience a little bit of harm because they're not used to experiencing things that are out of their control or out of their preference zone. They're used to catering everything around them to maybe they were spoiled or something, okay? And so these individuals will co-opt trigger warning and use it to, enact their narcissistic, and I'm not using it in the personality disorder, their self-centered notions that the world needs to conform to their preferences. And they'll claim they're being harmed, but they're not actually being harmed. And then that starts to run away with itself. And that's probably a larger group of people, or at the very least a more noticeable group of people. Because people with PTSD don't stand up and say, like, I have PTSD. It's not something that people are super proud of. They should be proud of it, that they survived, but there's a lot of shame. So it's not common that people would be like just talking about it a lot. It's changing because of lack of stigma, but anyway, or reducing of stigma. Then you have this group of people that are very at the very least, journalists and conservatives particularly will point to these snowflakes in college class that are like too sensitive and are constantly calling trigger warning. And then the society starts to question trigger warning. Trigger warnings is just a way for people to be too soft, right? Meanwhile, you have people with actual PTSD that are being completely ignored, and they don't have a phrase anymore. They need some other, because they say trigger warning, unless you spend hours educating everyone on what PTSD is and then you're going to be associated with the inaccurate or the disingenuous use of the phrase trigger warning. And so it's harmful when these concepts creep away, like with gaslighting, for example. There's a group of people that have been using the word gaslighting and gaslit, both clinicians and victims through recovery, as a way to understand and label and talk about the actual gaslighting that occurs within a long-term, high-control, abusive relationship, whether it's in a cult or in a marriage or at work or something. You actually start to lose trust in your ability to perceive reality and judge reality. You start to think, I don't know how to think. I don't know how to judge things. I'm stupid or I'm crazy, when you never were. And that is incredibly destructive and very useful to high control individuals, because once they can get you to believe that, they can do anything they want to you, because they can shape entire reality around whatever they want it to be, because you have lost confidence in your ability to know anything. That's real. That's gaslighting. So when someone is just in an argument with someone that, like a friend, and there's no abuse and there's no pattern here, and the person is like, like an example that I'll see is someone will be what did I see online? Something like where one person is, two people they're in a minor conflict, and I think it was Ethan and Trisha, right? I'll just say it was them. I don't know if it was them, but Ethan was telling Trisha, I think you were angry before. And Trisha was saying, no, I wasn't. I wasn't angry. And we don't know. Maybe she wasn't angry. But she did kind of look like she was angry. But we don't know. We're not inside of her. And then Ethan said, come on, you were angry. Something like that. And Trisha said, you're gaslighting me. Okay. People will co-opt that word because they've learned it's a respected word, that when you drop that word, people listen and they have sympathy for you. So they just start dropping this word gaslighting around because they feel like they're not being heard, I think is what's happening. And they don't know what to grab onto. And so they grab onto these clinical words because they can. And then and when you use a word like that, the audience doesn't know enough about gaslighting or abusive relationships in general to counteract anything you're saying. You're like, oh, I guess maybe you're right, because I don't know how to respond to that. Anyway, so with boundaries, I think it's a similar thing. Okay, so let's take a break. All right, getting back to FPL's quote of the article. The article says, quote, "The story of boundaries, which I'll retrace here, took me back to the early 1990s when boundaries erupted suddenly into the self-help mass market, and then to the mid-60s when they cropped up on the fringes of ego psychology." Okay, well, if we're going to talk about boundaries within ego psychology, then we're really talking about a different sort of, I'm chiming in here, then we're really talking about a different usage of that word, because that's far afield from family systems theory. And then FPL asks me, you were trained in the 1990s, right? Do you remember this happening? Is there any context missing? Just chiming in. Yeah, I feel like I've already been over that. There's, I was trained in the 90s, and I feel like I've already been over the nuances on that. Now, I don't know the history of the use of boundaries within self-help. I'm guessing that the first set of publications would be fair usage of the word boundaries, where people are talking to people who are being imposed upon or abused. And the self-help book is saying, I imagine a lot of the boundary, I do remember a lot of talk along these lines of assertiveness, right? You have a lot of people who have been socialized or harmed in a way that resulted in them defensively not being assertive. Defensively meaning as a defense against the pain and the fear. There's a defense mechanism that develops, and non-assertiveness or allowing yourself to be trodden upon is a defense against it's a lesser of two evils. Anyway, so for the self-help market, they were trying to appeal to a lot of people in that situation by saying, hey, you deserve boundaries, or you need to establish boundaries. If you don't establish boundaries, then you're at fault or at least partially at fault, when other people will just walk all over you. You can't just wait for people to respect your boundaries. You have to establish them. You have to react. I remember a lot of self-help like that. And that's not the Minuchin-Bowen sense of the word at all, but not a bad usage of the word boundary, right? We could all kind of get behind that. All right, going on with the article, quoting it. And then the floodgates opened in 1991. A therapist named Anne Catherine published a book called Boundaries, Where You End and I Begin, proclaiming the value of divvying up your emotional life. The next 2 years saw a parade of titles like Boundaries in Relationships, da-da-da-da. Yeah, I don't know. And then Lyndon asked me, are boundaries as a concept mostly the arbitrary result of self-help books? Not in the clinical field. So, and that's a whole other thing. Like the self-help realm is to a large extent, if not the vast majority of the time, it's completely separate from the clinical world. A lot of people think they're related. Now, a lot of clinicians write self-help books, but in my circle anyway, we will have no idea what's happening with the general public. The general public can be reading this one book on this one thing, and everyone is talking about it, right? And we might not even hear about it because it's just not the sort of things we talk about. It's not the kind of publishers we'd pay attention to. Even if we did hear about it, we'd be like, well, that's a self-help book. It's not like below us, but it's probably too simplistic. It's not the sort of thing that we get into. So there could have been a time when there were even 3 definitions that were being used. You had the Minuchin definition of boundaries, then you had the clinical usage of boundaries regarding assertiveness, and then you had this 3rd definition that was being used by self-help, and maybe a 4th definition that's kind of being used on Twitter. Anyway, another quote here. Boundaries do this by teaching us to relate to other people as if they are the one thing social systems are most determined to project, which is property. Most boundaries books of the early 1990s unselfconsciously steal imagery from land ownership. There's a quote in here. Just as homeowners set physical boundary lines on their land, we need to set up mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual boundaries for our lives to help us distinguish. Yeah, just chime me in. Yeah, it's just metaphors, and it is interesting and notable that in self-help they would use that metaphor because that's the world we kind of live in. And let's see what point they're getting at here. But generally, boundaries came to psychoanalysis from the outside as if slipping in through the service entrance. 2 early family therapists, Murray Bowen and Salvador Minuchin, borrowed the term from the interdisciplinary science of systems theory in the 1960s. Yeah, this is all true. Which has vague associations with the U.S. military. Yeah, it's also. I mean, most of psychology had something to do with the military. A lot of psychology in the United States actually was catalyzed by military funding and attention. There's a lot of money. A lot of things generate from money. I hope we understand that in our capitalistic society. And during World War II, of course, there was a lot of money and taxes being poured into the effort of winning the war. And one of the wings of that effort had to do with psychology on a number of different levels, but one of them was evaluating soldiers at the beginning of their training as to their aptitudes or their even eligibility to become a soldier, but also evaluating them during war, because of course people started to have reactivity to war, and then after the war, right? So you have all this money, because if psychologists and psychiatrists can make soldiers more effective and more effectively determine which soldiers should be doing what, then you can save a lot of money in other places if you pour money into this. And so there were a lot of clinical efforts, but also research efforts going on. And so there was a lot of discovery, and a lot of our major figures kind of emerged from that money and from that effort. And entire professions were created. I don't quote me on this, but I think psychologists kind of came into their own, because before it was, a lot of psychoanalysts and a lot of psychoanalysts, and then at some point, during World War II, don't quote me on that. Anyway, point is that a lot of things had to do with the U.S. military. Anyway, going on. It sees the world as a set of systems, this is talking about Bowen and Mnuchin. It sees the world as a set of systems, which share the same principles, whether they are families, solar systems, or molecules. Yeah, I've already been over that. Systems must maintain their boundaries, taking some things in and keeping others out in order to continue to exist. Yeah, that's all right. Then Linden chimes in and says, I don't know enough about systems theory to tackle this. The reference to the military application seems designed to resonate with the later comments about geopolitics and fighting communism, etc. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what they're referring to, but Murray Bowen and Salvador Minuchin, from my memory, Murray Bowen, from my memory, one of his major early funding sources had to do with trying to find a cure for schizophrenia. And what he did was he looked at the family. So, he gets this huge amount of money, him and his team, I believe. And instead of doing what a lot of other people were doing, like studying personality or psychiatry or something, he wanted to look at families. And so he, from my memory, this is all top of my head, that he got a bunch of patients with schizophrenia, and then he got their families to come in, and actually they all stayed in these bungalows, I believe, and were provided with early versions of family therapy and early versions of Bowenian therapy. And what Bowen was trying to demonstrate was that if you treat the system and the boundaries and the differentiation, all that kind of stuff, then the symptoms of the person with schizophrenia would not only reduce, but would stay reduced. Because what was happening was the observation, and this is true, that if the person with schizophrenia, suffering from schizophrenia, they live with their parents, let's say they're 25, and you put them in the hospital and say they get better symptom-wise, and you release them when their symptoms are mostly gone, they go back to their home, and the symptoms come back. And so there was this confusion about that. Like, well, what's happening? Because, if you cure someone's cancer and they go to live with their family, their cancer doesn't emerge just based on their social context, right? But this observation of psychology. Now, schizophrenia is a lot more complicated and more biological than I think they knew at the time, because they didn't really have the technology to even ask those questions, really. But research shows even today that stress level and systems operations can absolutely affect the symptoms and the severity for individuals with schizophrenia. Anyway, and so the idea was, well, if we really want to help people with schizophrenia, we have to actually zoom out and look at the system, right? And so Bowen and his team got a lot of money along those lines to look at schizophrenia. And anyway, so going on with what Linden is saying. But the more I thought about it, like many things that are useful, systems theory may have been used in the military and many other fields. The comment starts to sound a bit like, aren't cooks kind of suspicious? Don't they miss? Yeah. Right. I don't know every detail of the history of systems theory and family therapy in the military. From my memory, off the top of my head, there's not a connection there. And even if there were, it wouldn't mean some sort of nefarious thing, right? Now, systems theory was used in the military specifically with missiles, guided missiles. There's this concept called cybernetics, which is that when we have these movie usages of cybernetics, like it's Terminator 2 and all that kind of stuff. But the technical definition of cybernetics is, or at least a portion of it, from my understanding, I'm sure experts would be able to expand on this, but when you have cybernetics, in terms of the way I was taught and the way I use it and the way we use it in systems theory, is that a cybernetic system adjusts to input so that a goal can be reached. So with a missile, if you're trying to hit a tank and you just shoot the missile at it and there's no guidance system, it might miss, right? The tank might move, the wind might push it. But if you have a cybernetic system that can measure, what's happening, and so you point it at the tank, and then the wind pushes it. Well, it has these fins that on the side of the missile that can sort of direct it back to in line with hitting the tank, right? Or if the tank moves, then the missile is able to adjust to that, right? So this has to do with like feedback and how systems operate. And understanding how systems operate and understanding how cybernetics operate, in the military, they would use this, obviously. And in family systems theory, we would also use the general systems theory and cybernetics in that, like when I was talking about me and my wife, when the two of us are, let's say, we go through, let's say I'm working a lot. That's kind of easy to tell an analogy, and it's causing distance between me and my wife because we're not spending a lot of time together. Well, our system has a cybernetic mechanism regarding feedback loops. I won't bore you with those details, that will automatically kick in to adjust to help the system to operate optimally. And one of the mechanisms might be that Stacy might miss me, or I might have a longing to be with her, or when we are together, we both feel this urge to bond more with the time that we have available after I'm done with work or something. So those are those mechanisms. Now, there's all these other feedback loops and mechanisms that we can talk about, like me worrying about self-employment and how at any moment my entire business could go belly up if, for example, you patrons just decide not to be patrons. It would just completely throw my family into chaos. I mean, not that we would not survive, but it would, so I have that anxiety, and there's that influence into that system of me and Stacy. That reality is, coming into our relationship. And if I don't have the ability to let that in, then I won't be able to adjust. But if I let it too much in, then it might cause too much anxiety, or too much of my motivation will be around worries of my business going belly up, that it'll take me away from other things. So there's all these mechanisms and self-adjusting mechanisms that will kick in. And they're routines. They're not choices necessarily that we make. Me and Stacy have been together a long time, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. There are certain patterns that we fall into almost automatically, if not automatically, that help us to function well. And then, of course, the opposite can be true. If you have a system that's not functioning well, it's the same. The pattern is the problem. It's not the individual. So I hope this is all making sense. So getting back to the article here, the article made some good points, and even though it was published, so this is all from Linden, and even though it was published in longer form in a psychoanalysis magazine, I started to think of your videos about the Sopranos image of therapy and its misinterpretation, at least of the West Coast therapy. Some of the commentary is definitely tempered, right? So what Linden is saying, I think this article might be misrepresenting family systems and boundaries in the way that sometimes Linden will see me point that out. Like when I was watching The Sopranos and reacting to it online, I was pointing out how if I'm remembering right, that I was saying, oh, this therapy is not representative of what a lot of therapists would do. Anyway, so going on. So in my usual style, I have a couple of summary questions. What use does the concept of boundaries have in modern therapy? Okay, just chiming in. Good question, Lyndon. Again, your emails are always just brilliant and provoke me to talk about things I don't get a chance to talk about usually. But what does the concept of boundaries have in modern therapy? Well, it's not a common concept, although it is commonly talked about. It's not a formalized concept. It is a formalized concept within family therapy, within that realm. And even that, even though, like I said earlier, a lot of family therapists, anecdotally, don't really understand the concept of boundaries because they don't understand the concept of systems in general, because it's really fucking hard to understand. And unless you had a really kick-ass professor and you spent years of your life really trying to, because it's a paradigm shift. You have to completely shift, because it's not just a clinical thing. Everything in our life, especially in the United States, we think linearly. So that's the opposite of systems thinking, is linear thinking. And there's nothing wrong with linear. In the family systems world, if you say, oh, that's linear thinking, a lot of time that's an insult. It's not an insult in my book. It's a particular mode of thinking, If I'm walking down the street and someone comes up to me and punches me in the face and my face hurts and I'm looking for an explanation as to why my face hurts, I don't have to think systemically. I can think linearly. Someone punched me in the face. That's why my face hurts. I don't have to zoom out and understand the broader context. Like someone just randomly came up to me and punched me. It's a linear reality. I could look at it systemically, but I don't have to find a satisfying solution or a satisfying conceptualization. And what defines a satisfying conceptualization is, the concept drives the treatment, meaning that if someone punched me in the face and I evaluate it linearly, I say that person punched me in the face, they're to blame. I need to run away from that person. If I stop to think systemically, I might stay next to that person. They can continue to punch me. So sometimes linear thinking is very helpful. When a spark plug goes wrong in your car, sometimes you just have to take out the spark plug and change it. It's just a linear situation. You don't have to figure out how the whole system works. Now, if your spark plug continues to go out in your car, then you got to think systemically, because it could be part of the distributor cap or the power supply or something. There's something going on in the overall system. And that's a very crude example, because even that you consider could still be linear. But anyway, point is that systems thinking is so outside, because all day long we are thinking linearly. We're taught linearly. We talk linearly. Our language is evidence of our linear thinking. Other cultures actually have an easier time with systems thinking because their language and their culture is at least somewhat more systemically oriented. They're not completely, still a tremendous amount of linear thinking within other cultures as well, but they have a little bit of easier time. People in the United States have a really hard time. And so it requires you to think and observe and understand in a way that is divorced from everything that you're taught, everybody's language, everything, the president said this, therefore this will happen, linear, instead of like, well, what's the bigger picture? You have voters and you have fears and you have, segments of society. Like seeing it zoomed out can also just be overwhelming, right? It's so much easier just to hate one person or to blame one person or attribute something, even if it's positive, right? Attributing to one person is easier than wondering about all the factors that played into why something happened, right? So I don't blame people. Anyway, so what does the concept of boundaries have in modern therapy? It's not, in my anecdotal experience, it's not talked about clinically. It's not in the literature unless it's talking about Mnuchin and Bowen and stuff. Assertiveness is talked about, limits, requests, having your own rights. Those are all things that are talked about clinically going on. But I will say that when you hear therapists that are consulting with each other, you will absolutely hear people talking about boundaries. Like if someone were consulting, if I were to consult about a client that was having issues with assertiveness, I would very likely hear from other therapists, even other family therapists, that would say, it sounds like your client needs to establish boundaries, that kind of thing. Okay. Are there versions or interpretations of the concept you dislike? Yeah, I've already been over that. Does the idea make sense outside of family systems disciplines? Again, depends on what we mean by quote unquote the idea. Is there just a more general problem with good psychotherapy concepts being popularized? Yes, I've already been over that. Can we take on board the possible political, geopolitical origins or resonances or concepts in family therapies, but still hold on to their value as interventions and therapies? I think what Lyndon is talking about is that if you, absolutely. So I don't know if this is what Lyndon is talking about, but what I will say to this is that when we look at Bowen and others and just the entire field of psychology, psychotherapy, what you see are a lot of Westerners, people from the United States and mostly Western Europe as well. You have a small set of people, and also a small set of people within those people. It's a lot of white people and a lot of white men. So when we look at that, a lot of the assumptions and goals and givens and understandings emerge from white men in the Western world. And therefore, we can critique it on that basis. And for some, that would mean that they reject the whole enterprise. But for many, including me, it just means we have to understand it within that context and critique it, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is wisdom there, potentially. You have to decide for yourself if there's anything in there for you. So for me, for example, it's not a black and white thing. It's not like because there's all sorts of valid critiques against Freud. And yet, for me, there's a lot of things that Freud contributed, not only in a way that provokes a great amount of appreciation of him and his efforts, but also just flat out adhering to a lot of his theory and using it and liking it, So all can be true there. Going on, is defense a more useful idea than boundary, or is it just a different focus? I think I've already been over that. Do you prefer differentiation, enmeshment, etc., to the idea of boundaries conceptualized at the individual level? Well, right, I haven't even gone into differentiation. So everything that I've been saying about boundaries and systems applies to differentiation. And what I'll say in brief, so that this doesn't go on too long, is that the differentiation idea is another angle. And what I'll say briefly is that, going back to that scenario where my wife comes home and she's unglued about someone that was horrible on the highway to her, in that moment, I have to not only be differentiated enough from her, not separate, differentiated. It's kind of a bad word because it sounds like it's more of and it is reflective, I think, of Murray Bowen's white maleness, that it privileges individuation and standing alone. The word differentiation, it's sort of a glass half empty way of looking at things, because as a part of differentiation and its contemporary understanding is that differentiation is a balance and a flexibility between being very close to someone and being very separate from someone. So anyway, in that moment, my wife is talking about what happened to her, and I have to establish enough differentiation and enough separateness, but not too much. So on one hand, I want to be together. So differentiation is the balance between togetherness and separateness. That's just one way of putting it. And that's the way he put it. And so I want to be together with Stacy because I want her to feel that I'm with her and I can feel bad for her and that I'm listening to her. And I also want to be together so that I can have empathy, because if I'm too separate, I won't know what she's feeling. I won't feel what she's feeling. I won't feel it, and it won't show in my facial expressions as I'm listening, right? Because when she's telling me about this, if I'm together with her enough, it will just provoke facial expressions from me of like, oh my God, right? And she can benefit from that openness and that togetherness that I have with her in that moment. Or you could say that's between the two of us. Differentiation is more individual oriented. You could kind of hear it in my language. Earlier I would say the system would call for a boundary of this. In this instance, I'm talking about the differentiation of me, and that is, like I said, it's like a different angle. It's a slightly different way of conceptualizing and languaging the whole thing. And Bowen tended to work with individuals, whereas Mnuchin tended to work with the whole family. Anyway, so I need to be together enough, but I also need to be separate enough so that I don't drown in her emotions, such that it would lead to bad things of me rejecting her or trying to control the situation or running out the door and trying to kill someone or whatever, or being too worried of her leaving the house in the future, That would be another lack of differentiation result, would be that the next time she wants to go to the store, I'd be like, I'll go for you. And she's like, why? And I'll just go for you. I just don't want anything bad happen to you. You could see a lot of ill effects from that. And I'm absorbing too much of it, right? So I need to be separate and together. That's the differentiation, Bowen contemporary language. It's my language. It's not every Bowenian wouldn't word it that way, but that's the way I word it. So going on. P.S. I heard about the trolling and abuse you received after the Depp Heard videos, and it was deeply saddening and upsetting to hear. Hope you're doing well. Kind regards, FPL. Well, thanks. That's great. Yeah, it's been 2 years. Like I said, I think Lyndon sent this email a long time ago, but it's been 2 years since that trial-ish, or almost 2 years. And I feel 99% recovered. I had to put a lot of effort from various different angles to adjust emotionally. And I won't go over it again because I've already been over it. But yeah, I feel pretty good. As a product of me feeling more recovered is that I feel like I can talk more safely on the podcast. I feel more safe. I didn't feel safe after all that. And I guess if I think about it, like me and Berto, we did this whole deep dive on neo-Nazis. I'm pretty sure if I didn't feel safe, I wouldn't have even begun to do that topic. But I did, at the whole time, I did not feel unsafe heading into a very fraught area, right? And Berto and I went down topic areas that were, pretty fraught. Politics, Republicans, Democrats. And I feel like I have returned to the state that maybe even before the pandemic, really, because, this really kind of has two layers. I won't go down this rabbit hole too far, but when, before the pandemic, I was somewhat, I had an audience, but it was big enough such that I was able to scale back a lot of my private practice, and I was seriously considering retiring from my job as a professor, or at least scaling back significantly. I was making enough money on Patreon, to be specific, to be able to do that financially. And I, things were going, it'd been 11 years up until that point to get there, and obsessing about the podcast the whole time to get there. And then when and during that time, I was, and I think when you listen to reruns from around that time, I'm not holding back, really. I'm exhibiting that I feel safe enough to just talk off the cuff and maybe take some risks with topics or things that I was saying. I wasn't, completely unhinged or anything, but just fluid and comfortable. Then when the pandemic happened and I started making these reaction videos, and suddenly a lot of new people, I guess one way of putting it is that during that time, like midway through 2020, the vast majority of people who were consuming my content had just discovered me like a month or two earlier. And so when I would say something that was out of the boundaries that they thought, using the word boundaries, of what they thought was what I should be saying or what they were used to me saying, I would get this reaction from everyone, even though I was saying things that I was saying a few months earlier and there was no reactivity. And so that affected me too. I started to pull back on the reins because this whole new world started opening up to me. It's like, well, what can I say? And on the audio podcast, I always felt more free because, the vast majority of, the new people weren't listening to audio podcasts. But anyway, so I would say that I became maybe 10 to 15% uncomfortable about the words that were coming out of my mouth when I was making content. And then when the trial happened midway through 2022, then like it pushed me to probably like 60 to 70% uncomfortable, to the point where I would just be doing a casual episode with Umberto and I'd be second guessing everything that I was going to say. And the whole time I did not feel like I was having fun or that I was enjoying the process. It wasn't fulfilling. It just felt like I was in constant danger. And, I literally had people that, I won't go into details, but, there was physical threat of, well, I'll just say, the kind of stuff that you hear other people experiencing. I experienced some of it. And, the authorities were involved. Government agencies were involved, out of my control. I won't go into details. Like, so I never called the authorities. The authorities just found out. And again, I won't go into details, and still are involved. But anyway, so, it was scary. And through a joint systemic process of me and you and Stacy and Alina and all my friends and Umberto and Bob and Rebecca and me and you and Stacy and everyone else, I, worked on how to create a place where we can all be safe and feel safe and good and comfortable while still pressing the envelope, right? Still pushing those boundaries, if you will, of comfortability, but taking care of each other and me taking care of myself and me also reaching out. A big part of me gaining safety is actually revealing to you what's going on for me, because without that, you might just think, well, he's saying those things because he just doesn't care or whatever. But if you know, then you're more likely to, if you do respond or provide feedback, take into account the reality of what I'm going through. Not that you wouldn't give me negative feedback or something, but that, it's a different thing, right? If you know what's going on with me and I'd say something that pisses you off, you're more likely to word it differently and understand it differently. Whereas if you didn't know that, you would just think I was just a jerk face, and then you would feel you had license to just also at least be kind of a jerk face back to me. You know what I mean? So, it involved a lot of things, and it was, I worked on it. And it's reflective of what it's like to be a therapist. When we, as professionals, go through moments like that, which happen a lot, especially when you focus on particular kinds of things like personality disorders, you're going to have those moments. And it's a healing process that involves a lot of different components, right? Like there were times in my practice when I would have a really, really bad experience with a personality disordered client, for example, and I would pull back on all my clients emotionally because I didn't feel safe in general, right? And how do I pull out of that? What do I do? How do I get out? Do I even know what's happening? Do I have systems in place to react to that? Where's my vulnerability? Who am I vulnerable to? How do I notice when I feel safe again? How do I see the situation? What do I need to do to protect myself, but also still being open to clients? That's what it's like to be a therapist. It's this constant awareness and effort, and also acknowledgement of reality along those things. That's why I love being a therapist, because other sort of disciplines, jobs, they don't have that tradition. And so, although you might have an individual that likes to do that, their colleagues might look at them like, "Why are you so introspective? Why are you staring at your navel all the time? Like, get on with it. Just move on." So being a therapist to me really empowers me, and all other therapists, to be able to manage a lot of aspects of life, not just how to help people. You know what I mean? So let's adjourn there. Let me know what you think. And I always love hearing from you, famous patron Lyndon. Your emails are kick-ass. You might want to be careful on how many you send me because they're so in depth that but anyway, Lyndon goes way back on and I always love hearing from people and staying connected to people who go back to the sort of, not the beginning. I don't think anyone's with us. And I would put a lot of money down that there isn't a single person that consumes my content that was a fan in the first 4 years. If you are one of those people, please let me know. I'm talking 19. I'm talking 2008 to 2012. I'm imagining that none of you, I don't know, maybe like some of my former students, if you're still listening, because you would have, anyway. So when I'm talking about old OG fans, I'm talking about people that maybe started listening in 2014 or something, which is a long ass time ago, but it's still like 6 years into the podcast. It's just kind of funny that like you have this thing that no one remembers that you spent all this time on for the first number of years. Anyway, which is fine. And I hope no one remembers it, because that content was at the very least tonally it's a lot different, but it's also, I didn't know what I was doing. I was just a therapist trying to be an internet content person, and there was no guide. Now you go to YouTube, you're like, how do I create a channel? And there's all this, all these guides and articles about, like, back then you're just like, I think you just point a camera at something or a mic and you just talk or something. I don't know. Anyway, so it's always great to hear from you, famous patron Lyndon, and everyone out there. Please take care of yourself and think about your boundaries, meaning think about how the roots here. Okay, here's the thing. The next time you're in a fight or some bad experience with someone close to you, if you care to, thinking systemically requires thinking, okay, what is the pattern? If I were outside of that situation, what would happen? Another area you can look at is if you have kids or there's other people in your life who are fighting, it's easier to kind of sit back and watch, or as objectively as possible, like take an account of like the exact sequence. This is what I do with my students. I say, start with a sequence of behavior. What exactly? Don't analyze it yet, because if you don't know what you're analyzing, you're just analyzing a random story in your head. So you have to know what it is, and what it is systemically is the sequence. This person said this, then this person did this, then this person did that, then this person said that, then this person does that. A little deeper is inferring emotion. This person did this, which caused this person to feel this, which caused them to do this, which caused this other person to feel this, which caused them to do this. And that's a little deeper. You're inferring. You're not necessarily completely aware, of course, but it's a little. But at the very least, you're still in that sequence area. Then you can analyze it. You can start to look at things systemically. Once you have that understanding, because usually what people do linearly is like that person's a jerk face and that person is a victim of the jerk face. I see this when I watch reality TV, that the audience will tend to react to reality TV with this urge, this like desperation to figure out who's the bad guy and who's the good guy. Or, I mean, a lot of times they're like, everyone's a bad guy, but one person's less of a bad guy. And that can be a useful way of looking at it, and it might be a coherent way of looking at it, but it's only one way of looking at it. Another helpful, coherent way of looking at things is, look, no one's a bad guy, everyone's a bad guy, whatever, but how does the system operate? What are the rules? What are the boundaries? How did the boundaries react? What are the boundaries around this relationship and the rest of the world? What's the pattern? What's the routine? When this person does this, what does this person do? What are the needs of the system and how are they being met? Are the boundaries flexible enough and healthy enough and have enough reactivity such that everyone can get their needs met? That's the, in my language, I rarely, if ever, hear systems theorists talk like this, family systems theorists talk like this, but unless you add this in, I feel like you're just floating in space. So the system, the family system, the system of me and Stacy, a big part of its purpose is to optimize our needs being met, which involve our individual needs and our needs as a couple. And so do our boundaries and our routines and our patterns, do they facilitate our needs being met? So when I'm getting out of the car and I have this upwelling of love for my wife, I mean, part of it is like, how did we even get there? Because earlier in the day, she came into my office and said, do you want to do something tonight? You want to go to dinner or something? So that's something that happened and then we could go further back and enter her emotions. Where did that come from? Why? And also, what barriers weren't there for her? Because if she worried I was going to reject her, then she might not say that, right? Or if I had hurt her feelings earlier in the day, it would interfere with her enacting that urge or even having it in the first place, right? So when you start to really analyze systems, you start to see it in that way. No one's to blame. No one is responsible, so to speak, for the entirety of how a system operates, right? It's happening. And so anyway, as I had that upwelling of love for her as I'm getting out of the car, and I say, hey, come here. Why did I do that? Why did I not feel afraid to do it? Why did I feel safe to do it? Why did Stacy, like within the blink of an eye, slam into me? And then even the micro, as we are standing there having some affection, what are the exact muscle movements really, right? Because that's all safety-based and routine-based. We have a routine to the way we do that. We have a routine to the way that we ask for that. And some systems don't have those routines. And so it's not like, hey, you're a jerk face, you never say you love me or you never kiss me or hug me. It's the system doesn't have a routine to facilitate that. And in order to establish those routines, the homeostasis has to change. It has to, sometimes it requires dismantling all the rules that are operating on a system. And of course, our childhoods inform our tendencies regarding certain routines, the routines and the patterns that were developed and we saw in our family of origin, we tend to repeat those, but we can absolutely establish new routines, right? And for some people, what family therapy is about is just introducing a new routine that they didn't even know was possible, that they had never seen before, and are, their minds are blown, like, wait, we could be doing that. And so the way that family systems think is like, your relationship isn't broken or your spouse isn't broken. We just have to change your routine, and we have to figure out what routines should be discarded and what routines need to be added. And it's not as easy as just saying, look, you just need to hug and kiss more. It's everything. It's safety, it's love, it's your emotions, it's how do you notice each other, it's the boundaries, it's outside things that are involved, it's how differentiated everybody is. It's very complicated. It's not just like telling a client you need to create a new pattern of kissing and hugging more. Like, there's a reason why they're not doing it. Partially it's because of modeling, but partially it's because of there's something going on that's interfering with their natural desire to hug and kiss. They naturally want to do that. What's getting in the way? How did it get in the way? How do we change that pattern? What pattern do we have to create to change the pattern? That's a whole other thing. It gets complicated. Anyway, so you can think about for yourself, either observing from the outside or yourself, of, like a real easy thing is you have a fight with your partner, and then at some point that's soon enough after that you remember enough of the details, but not so soon that you're still undifferentiated. So as soon as you establish enough differentiation and can look at it as objectively as possible, you want to try to recall. And sometimes, you have to make stuff up, like, well, I'm pretty sure this isn't exactly how things went down, but this is an approximation that this person did this and that I did that. And then generally my partner did this and then I did this. And then you can start to see, when you look at it in that way, in that systemic routine pattern from above, zoomed out way, different solutions emerge other than my partner needs to stop being an asshole or I need to stop being an asshole. You start looking at, okay, how did the system start not in conflict, but then eventually it was in the throes of conflict? What's going on with this couple? What's going on with the outside of the system and the broader system? You can understand why people avoid thinking this way, because it introduces billions of factors. It's like trying to predict the weather, which is another system, which is impossible to predict. And it gets hard. And I understand why people avoid it. I avoid it. It hurts my brain. But the solutions and the accuracy that it provides is superior to a lot of linear ways of thinking, particularly when we're talking about relationships. And that's why family therapists, couple therapists, originally back in the 50s and 60s were attracted to systems theory, because that was a general systems theory. It was a theory for all systems, whether it's ecology, the weather, a cell, a molecule, the solar system, a political system, the system of the world, a societal system, an organization system, the system of a company. Applying it to families really opened up a whole new landscape to explore, discover, and help. And everyone out there, please take care of yourself, because you deserve it. You really, really do.